Welcome back to the channel. We have a different type of video today. It's been a while since our last upload. I've been working on my mock expansion draft for the Seattle Kraken that's coming up this offseason. I'm likely to make a revised version of this at the end of the season, but for now, these picks are mostly in flux due to the trade deadline coming. So we'll start with the rules, the basic rules for the expansion draft. Each team will have two options in terms of protection. They can either protect 7 forwards, 3 defensemen, and 1 goalie, or 8 skaters, defense or forwards, and a goalie. The second option is most commonly used in a format of 4 forwards and 4 defensemen. All players with no movement clauses at the time of the draft must be protected unless they waive their no movement clause. All players who have under 2 years of professional experience, AHL or NHL, or are unsigned draft choices are exempt from selection and do not count toward the protection limit. In addition, all NHL teams must meet the minimum requirements regarding players exposed for the selection in the draft. 1 defenseman was under contract in 2021-22 and has played at least 27 games in the season prior. 2 forwards were under contract in 21-22 and have played 27 games in this prior season, and 1 goalie who was under contract in 2021-22 or will be a restricted free agent at the end of his current contract immediately prior to 2021-22. If a team elects to make a restricted free agent goalie available to meet this requirement, that goalie must have received his qualifying offer prior to the submission of the team's protected list. Players with potential career-ending injuries who have missed more than the previous 60 consecutive games cannot be used to satisfy a team's exposure requirements unless approval is given from the NHL itself. Such players may also be deemed exempt from selection. Another thing to consider is players who are UFAs this upcoming offseason. I'm almost considering them like another form of protection. In most cases, there isn't much point to protecting a UFA. All you are doing is preventing Seattle from signing them 2 days prior to the draft. So say if you were to protect a UFA, you would still have to negotiate with them in the offseason after the draft against every other team in the league. So there's almost no reason to protect that player because you're not gaining much out of it. So now we'll move on to the protections of each teams and who I think the Seattle will take. We'll start with Anaheim. The Ducks are in a pretty simple situation for the most part. Protect their future and keep as many young guys as possible. The only problem is, in order to keep their top D-men, they will have to leave Brendan Guhle and Josh Mahura available, and I think one of those two will be selected. The other questionable thing with this team is protecting guys like Henrik and Raquel, who seem to be on their way off the team via trade. I would say they protect Raquel if he is not traded, as he is younger, has more to offer, and seems more likely to stay on the team while Henrik is older and on a more expensive contract. In terms of who they will select between Josh Mahura and Brendan Guhle, I think they'll take Mahura. I think he has slightly more upside than Guhle, and I think will prove to be a valuable future asset for Seattle. The Coyotes are up next, and they are one of the teams that is strained by the exposure requirements. They need to leave 1 defenseman exposed that is under contract until 2022, but only 2 defensemen on their roster meet those requirements, Oliver Ekman-Larsson and Jacob Chychrun. Chychrun would be the obvious choice. He's younger, he's cheaper, and he's performing much better. He's proving himself to be a top defenseman this season. However, Oliver Ekman-Larsson has a no-move clause, therefore he has to be protected, which would leave Chychrun available and making him the obvious pick for Seattle. However, I doubt the Coyotes leave it that way. They have 3 options to make sure Chychrun does not get selected. Get Oliver Ekman-Larsson to waive his no-move clause, sign one of their current D-men to an extension that goes through the 2021-22 season, and leave them exposed, or trade for a D-man at the trade deadline who meets the exposure requirements. Boston, there isn't much really to discuss. They protect their core guys, which only leaves a couple of options for selections. For me, it comes down to Anders Bjork on offense and Jeremy Lauzon or Jakob Zorbril on defense. And I think Anders Bjork is the right move. He's a nice depth piece, and I think he has more value to the other, as there is much more talented defense depth pieces available throughout the draft on other teams. Next up is the Sabres, and they don't really have much to think about. They're in a pretty rough spot all around. Their entire team is not very good. But they do have a decision to make on defense for who they want to use their last protection on. There's a current solid D-man in Colin Miller, or a future solid D-man in Harri Jokiharju. And I think for me, they should choose to protect their future, as currently the Sabres aren't doing anything remotely close to successful, so they're better off having someone ready for the future. There's also not much point in protecting Taylor Hall's UFA rights, even if that means he wouldn't be able to go to Seattle before the draft, because there is almost no way he's going to re-sign with the Sabres after this miserable season. Next up, we have Calgary. Calgary is also in a pretty simple spot. It's on defense, their loss protection between Tanev or Killington, the constant young versus old debate. In this case, I would take Tanev. As much as I often favor the young guy, he's a very experienced and seasoned defender who has a lot to offer. Either way, I don't think Seattle takes either of them, unless Lucic waives his no-move clause. They could protect Backlund or Mangiapane on offense. But since it hasn't happened yet, the choice for me is between those two, and I can pretty decisively say Mangiapane is the better pick. Younger, lots of talent, and he's a great defensive forward who can be really good on the penalty kill. And I think he's a player who will really benefit from a change of scenery with a new team. Next up, we have Carolina. For Carolina, it's all about defense. They've got some great offensive pieces, but it's just outweighed by how amazing this defensive core is. So I don't even think there's any way that the Seattle will consider taking a forward. It's a matter of what D-man they will take. So their forward depth is very good. So if they took the 4 D-man route, they would be leaving some major offensive talent available, and that would make Seattle reconsider their options. Then, with the 3 defensemen you're going to protect, Jacob Slavin and Brett Pesce are must-protects. They're performing the best this season, outside of Dougie Hamilton, who is a UFA. So that leaves the final protection spot with Brady Skjei, Jake Gardiner, Jake Bean, and Hayden Fleury. I'd say Gardner's easily the first odd man out. Too old in comparison to how young these other guys are, and there isn't a huge skill gap between them. Then I'd say Brady Skjei is the next man out because he doesn't have the same room for growth as the other two. And then Bean and Fleury. I'd say Bean has more potential, is younger, and is also currently doing better than Fleury. So I would say the Canes would protect Bean, and Seattle would take Fleury. However, neither Skjei or Fleury is having a great season, so that pick is very much subject to change as the season moves on. Next, we have the Chicago Blackhawks. They don't have much to offer, as a lot of their top players like Kubalik and Doc are exempt as rookies. So there isn't much to offer. For me, it's between Connor Murphy defensively and Matthew Highmore offensively. And I think that Seattle will need a young forward more than a current D-man. And this was one of the picks I left to the end to decide based on what I needed, based on what I'd already selected due to the other teams. And I thought a young forward would be more valuable. And neither would really play a huge role in the lineup, so I think Highmore is better as he has more room to grow for the future. The Colorado Avalanche are one of the few teams using the 4-4 protection option. They have a lot of their key pieces on offense that are UFAs, so that leaves the forwards that are left available aren't as valuable as the D-man. So I think for the Avalanche, this just helps them narrow down which D-man they want Seattle to take, between Taves, Girard, and Graves. And I think they all have more value than everyone unprotected on offense. So in my opinion, I think Girard and Taves are much more important to the core of this team, as they are both having great seasons and are very valuable, which leaves Graves as the odd man out and the easy choice over the likes of Kadri, Nichushkin, and Donskoy. Next up, we have the Columbus Blue Jackets. They aren't a very deep team all around, and they don't have much to offer besides their protected players, as Mers Lincolns is exempt from selection, so really, Dean Kukan is the only desirable player. He's in his prime, he's having a decent season playing on the third D pairing with 1 goal and 3 assists as of March 19th. For the Dallas Stars, there are 2 desirable players, Radek Faksa and Joe Pavelski. Even though Pavelski might seem like the right pick currently, as he's having a great season, I don't think he's worth selecting. He's on a $7 million contract through 2022, and this team doesn't have much contract room to work with. And he's also 36, doesn't have many years left, and I don't expect him to be able to continue on this great pace of play. While Radek Faksa still has room to grow at 27 years old, and is on a solid $3 million contract through to 2025. The Detroit Red Wings also don't have much to offer, as they really just aren't that good, but Vladislav Nemesnikov is a solid piece. It makes sense to leave him unprotected, as all the forwards I'm protecting are under 26, while he's 28, so the 2-year age gap makes him the odd man out, but he'll still be a solid current piece for Seattle. Next up is the Edmonton Oilers, and this is a bit of a weird one. They don't really seem like a team that would use the 4-on-4 protection method, as their D-core isn't very strong, and they're known for their offensive firepower. But when you take away McDavid and Draisaitl, this offense is very limited, and they don't have much that they need to protect. It also helps that Tyson Barrie, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Adam Larson, and Tyler Ennis are all UFAs, which leaves the obvious last two forward protections to Jesse Puljujärvi and Kyle Yamamoto. Then I have Seattle taking Josh Archibald from the Oilers offense, and honestly, it's probably one of the worst picks out of all the teams. I could also see them going another direction and taking Zach Kassian to get some grit, or making a push to sign one of the UFAs. But realistically, the Oilers don't have much to offer for Seattle. For the Florida Panthers, I have Seattle selecting Noel Acciari, as I feel he is easily the most desirable player left available, and leaving him available is going against something I've mentioned repeatedly, which is age. I decided to protect Hornqvist and leave Acciari open, which is unlike what I did with most other teams, especially similar to the Pavelski situation. However, I feel this is different, as Hornqvist is playing very well and has had a huge impact on the success of this team, as they are a top team in the league right now in comparison to them being barely a playoff team last year. He's a key locker room guy, and I think he's definitely worthy of protecting. The Kings are another team that doesn't have much to offer. However, I did leave the likes of Jeff Carter and Dustin Brown available, as I would be hoping as the Kings that their successful seasons at that age, might tempt Seattle into taking on their contracts. As well as exposing those two is pretty much the only way they can meet the exposure requirements if they want to keep guys like Kempe and Wagner. So at their old age, it makes sense to leave them exposed. However, I think the better pick would be one of their exposed D-men. The choice would be between Olli Maatta and Sean Walker, and I think all signs point to Walker, as Maatta is more known for his offense and has never really been a great defender, and Walker is better than him in both of those categories, as he's on a much cheaper contract. The Minnesota Wild are in a rough spot and are pretty much stuck with the 4-on-4 system if they want to keep Dumba, as all three of their top D-men have no move clauses. Then on offense, they're decently lucky as they have a lot of their top players exempt or UFAs. However, they also have another two 30-plus-year-olds with no move clauses. So then they have two spots available for protections. I think Kevin Fiala is the easy first pick. I love Kevin Fiala. I think he's one of the most underrated players in this league. Then the last pick is between Jordan Greenway and Joel Eriksson Ek. And I think Greenway's performing a little bit better this season, and he brings a nice physical aspect to his game that separates him from Eriksson Ek. And then in regards to leaving Talbot exposed, it makes the most sense currently, as he isn't having that spectacular of a season, and Kaapo Kähkönen could be their future at that position. So for me, that leaves Eriksson Ek as the obvious pick. However, this selection is also subject to change, as I would assume the Wild will sort out the situation on D by having one of their D-men waive their no-move clause, or moving Dumba at the deadline. Montreal Canadiens. This is another tough team. Originally, I had the Habs leaving Drouin unprotected due to exposure requirements, but after looking it over, I think it was the wrong move, and I decided to protect Drouin over Jake Evans, who may be a young player with a solid future, but Drouin has been stellar for the Habs this season, and I couldn't just let myself leave him available. So instead, I protected Drouin, and then with that selection, I changed it to Joel Edmondson, as they're another team that have a lot of depth exempt, like Suzuki and Romanov, so there isn't much else that's up for debate with them. Next up, we have the Nashville Predators. The Preds are one of the only teams where I had them signing a UFA in a 2-day period prior to the draft, and I think that UFA will be Erik Haula. From what I understand, the Preds are unlikely to re-sign him, and I don't think he wants to stay in Nashville. So I think Seattle would be able to persuade him to sign with them, and he could prove to be a valuable asset for the team. The other option would be Mattias Ekholm, but I definitely think he's going to be dealt at the deadline, and either way, I think Seattle already has enough defense. A center is far more important. For the Devils, there isn't much of a decision to be made here. The protection's pretty straightforward, and after that it's between Miles Wood and Andreas Janssen. And for me, the pick is easily Miles Wood. He's on a cheaper deal and he's having a great season. I think he'll be a very valuable future asset for the Seattle Kraken. Next up, the first of two New York teams, the New York Islanders. The Isles have solid depth all over, so they're going to lose someone of importance, whether it's on offense or defense. Offensively, the best available is J.G. Pageau, who's having a great season and has been a very solid addition for them. But defensively, there's Scott Mayfield, who's a very solid defenseman and is also performing very well. In this situation, I'm going to take Mayfield. I just think in this case, he adds a little bit more value to the team over Pageau as a very experienced veteran defenseman with lots of talent. Now, the second New York team is the Rangers. They were in a pretty safe spot considering that a lot of their roster is exempt. And they also have the situation with Tony DeAngelo, which makes things a little bit simpler for the Rangers, but more complicated for the Kraken, as it's whether or not they'll be willing to take a chance on him. In my opinion, I don't think there's any team in the league that's willing to take a chance on DeAngelo right now, considering his locker room behavior. So originally, I was going to take Brandon Lemieux for my pick, but a few days before filming this, he got traded to the Kings, which makes things a little bit more complicated, as now only Ryan Strome and Kevin Rooney meet the exposure requirements, as the others on offense have no move clauses. Therefore, I have the Kraken taking Ryan Strome, but this is another one that is very subject to change at the trade deadline. Next up is the Sens, another team that doesn't have much to protect, as a lot of their good assets are exempt. Offensively, everyone that really needs to be protected will be protected from exemption or naturally. And defensively, besides Chabot, everyone else is either exempt or not worth a pick. Which leaves us with goaltending. Ottawa's goaltending isn't very good, and has been pretty rough this season with all the injuries. However, they do have Murray, who is known to be a solid goalie, and they signed him to a big contract this offseason, so I think they're going to protect him in this situation. But they do have a solid goaltending future prospect in Philip Gustafsson, who's actually played recently and has played pretty solid, and he also isn't exempt. This could be a great piece for the future of the Seattle Kraken, as I don't see Ottawa in the situation they're in leaving him available. So it depends how Ottawa decides to go about this whole goaltending situation, but I think that Seattle will take whichever one they don't protect, and right now I think that'll be Gustafsson. Next up, we have the Philadelphia Flyers. They were one of the tougher teams to decide on, as there are many routes to take. My final offensive protection choice came down to Lindblom, Van Riemsdyk, or Aube-Kubel. And I went with Lindblom, even though Van Riemsdyk is having a great season. He is 7 years older than Lindblom and is on a contract that pays him a lofty $7 million a year. James Van Riemsdyk or Nicholas Aube-Kubel. Originally, I decided on Aube-Kubel as he was, per usual, younger with more room to grow, but after I was reviewing my picks, I decided to switch it to Van Riemsdyk. Still not entirely sure if this is the pick I want to stick with, as Van Riemsdyk brings with him that massive $7 million contract, which could make it more difficult to sign their current RFAs or their future UFAs. So, again, a pick in flux. Next up, the Pittsburgh Penguins. For me, there isn't much debate around their protections. I think the only thing that might be debatable is protecting Jared McCann, but for me, I think he's the right pick. He is young, and he's a very good asset. I think he's been performing great for the Penguins with that next man up mentality. Then for the selection, it's between Blueger, Tanev, or Aston Reese. Tanev's a great player, very skilled, but it's his contract that drives me away, as he's getting paid $4 million a year, which I'm not willing to pay for him. Then Aston Reese and Teddy Blueger. I've seen lots of people choosing Aston Reese over Blueger, but for me, Blueger's my pick. He's a great end-to-end player, and I feel like he's just better all around. He's a great penalty killer, and I think he'll be a great depth piece for Seattle. Next up, the San Jose Sharks, and they are in a tough situation. They have no move clauses on aging players with long, expensive contracts, and they're very limited by the exposure requirements. And they're not even doing that well, so it's just bad all around. Defensively, I have them leaving Brent Burns unprotected for no reason other than to bait Seattle into taking him. He is performing the best out of their old defensemen, but he still is 36 years old with a contract that pays him $8 million a year until he's 40. So if the Kraken take him, As much as he is a solid defenseman currently, they can leave that contract off the table and not have to deal with his bad years. Offensively, it's very tough, but only Couture, Kane, LeBlanc, Hurdle, and Meyer meet the exposure requirements. For me, Meyer and Hurdle are the key pieces in our must-protects. Then between the other three, I say you definitely leave Kane exposed, as he's on an expensive contract and isn't quite performing as well. Then with Couture and LeBlanc, it's either a veteran leader for this team who is a key locker room guy, or a solid skilled player who has got lots of potential. For me, I'm going to protect Couture. Unless the Sharks miraculously turn their contract situation around, they're going to be in a rebuild for a while. So I think they'll lose out on the value of LeBlanc while he's still in his prime, while Couture is a great player currently and is a good player to keep around even at an old age to give leadership to the young prospects and give them a good role model. Then the choice becomes easy for Seattle as they can benefit from LeBlanc's talent immediately. Next up, we have the St. Louis Blues. For the Blues, there's only one decision that needs to be made, and it's on defense. It's between Vince Dunn, Colton Parayko, and Justin Falk for their last two defensemen protected. Torrey Krug is definitely the first D-man protected, but the other two spots are for these three. For me, I think they should go with Parayko and Dunn. Both are younger and are just as good as Falk. And then their contracts, Falk is on an identical deal to Krug, $6.5 million until 2027. And I would expect Dunn to get a similar contract this offseason. So I think it would be best for them to leave Falk exposed, offload his contract, then sign Dunn to that similar contract. Therefore, have Seattle taking Falk. Tampa is loaded with firepower at pretty much every position you can think of. So it's more a matter of who are they willing to lose. It is tempting to take a guy like Maroon, Killorn, or Johnson, but honestly, I just don't think any of them are worth that while, as they're just some average bets. I'd rather take a guy on defense like Cal Foote, who is young with lots of upside, and will be another great future asset for this team. Next up, we have the Toronto Maple Leafs. Toronto is another team like the Oilers. They don't have a very strong defense and are known for their offense, but don't have much forward depth, so I'll be going with the 4-4 protection strategy. Besides, even if they wanted to protect more forwards such as Kerfoot or Engvall, they can't, as those are the only two that meet the exposure requirements, so they're better off just protecting their D-men. But they are also in a good spot, as a lot of their top forwards such as Zach Hyman are UFAs. So the final pick comes down between Kerfoot and Engvall, and I think with that, Kerfoot becomes the easy pick. For the Canucks, I think they should be trying to bait Seattle into taking a contract such as Tyler Myers or Louis Eriksson. But having Braden Holtby available makes those players a little bit less tempting, as for some reason they signed him to a 2-year deal, knowing the expansion draft was coming up, and they were obviously going to protect Thatcher Demko. And for Seattle, Holtby is a goalie who can be a starting caliber goalie almost immediately, and he becomes the obvious choice. Next up, we have the Washington Capitals, who is a team with an aging core and a pretty dim future past the next couple of years, so really they just need to protect their current core so they can have a few more years of success. Once they've done that, it doesn't leave much available for Seattle to take offensively or defensively. However, they do have a rising star in Vitek Vanacek available in goal, and I think this pick perfectly rounds out the goaltending core for Seattle. They get a current starter who has proven himself in the past in Braden Holtby, a goalie who is starting to get his legs under him and has been proving his potential this season in Vitek Vanacek, who could really improve under working with Holtby as a duo. And then there's Gustafsson, who's a nice prospect who fits right into the backup role once Vanacek takes over full-time, and Vanacek eventually will take over Holtby's role and ease Gustafsson in the same way Holtby did. And last but certainly not least, the Winnipeg Jets. The Jets are another team in a tough spot due to exposure requirements. First, they protect their big key three, Scheifele, Ehlers, and Connor, all of which easily must protect. Then Wheeler has a no-move clause, so he must now be protected, but they only have two more players that meet the exposure requirements, and they both must be exposed. Those two are Mason Appleton and Pierre-Luc Dubois. I expect that Winnipeg has a plan to fix the situation, otherwise they wouldn't have signed Dubois to an extension after they traded for him. Either they'll trade for someone who meets the requirements of the deadline, or sign an extension to someone already on their roster and leave them exposed instead, or Wheeler will, or the least likely of the three, Wheeler will waive his no-move clause. Defense isn't a problem in their current state, but if they do manage to protect Dubois, their defense will be a lot more tempting than their offense. Neil Pionk and Josh Morrissey are must-protects, but the last one comes down to Sami Niku, Nathan Beaulieu, or Dylan DeMello. For me, I have them protecting Sami Niku, as he's a promising talent who has performed very well recently in the different national tournaments. But if they manage to protect Dubois, I expect them to take Dylan DeMello or Nathan Beaulieu as the replacement pick. But for now, it's Pierre-Luc Dubois is the great pick. Now we have the final depth chart for the Seattle Kraken mock draft. All around, I think this is a solid team, with lots of young talent ready to move up in the lineup when needed. The projected cap hit is for this upcoming offseason would be about $74 to $76.9 million, which leaves them about $5 to $7 million in cap space to sign their RFAs, their current RFAs, and Eric Holla, who is their only UFA that was signed before the draft, and potential free agents throughout the offseason. I do think, looking back on it, that there might be a few picks that would be changed due to cap reasons, as this puts them in a pretty rough spot for cap, being that a lot of the players are 2021 RFAs, and I would expect Eric Holla is going to take a lofty contract. That's all we have for you this video. Be sure to turn in next time for my next upload.